Good morning, everyone. Hope you all are doing well this wonderful Saturday morning. Although in the Bay Area, it's wet, very, very wet. We're gonna get started with the short video first.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's session. We are PreMed CC, a student-led organization established in the fall of 2021. Our goal as an organization was to create an online community for pre-medical students at community colleges and universities with the hope of guiding the next generation of diverse and inclusive physicians.
And while we advertise our organization as being for community college students, our events are open to anyone. We realize that finding guidance and mentorship in a pre-med journey can be especially challenging for first-generation pre-med students, people that lack the financial resources, or just those that do not know people in the medical field.
One of the best parts about our events is that they are virtual, so you can do it from the comfort of your own home. We typically have events on Fridays from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. PST, and on Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. PST.
If you aren't able to attend the event, all our sessions are uploaded on our YouTube channel. Many of our sessions will end with Q&A with our speakers. Any questions that you have can be put in the Q&A section on Zoom, and our team members will read them and have them answered.
After you have attended our event, you can log on to our website and complete the quiz, which will contain questions pertaining to our session today.
If you score 70% or higher on the quiz, you'll be awarded a 2-hour mentorship certificate to show that you attended our session today.
If you want to stay connected with our upcoming events or want to tell your pre-med friends about PreMed CC, you can find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok at PreMed CC.
Welcome. So we have Melissa Gonzalez. She is a fourth-year medical student at the USC Keck School of Medicine in Los Angeles, California, currently applying to psychiatry residency programs. She is interested in decreasing mental health stigma in minority communities and providing culturally sensitive care. Melissa is also passionate about mentorship and was inspired to create her Instagram page, brown_girl_white_coat, after navigating challenges as a first-generation pre-med student. So thank you so much for being here, Melissa.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here. Let me see if I can share my screen. All right, let me know if that looks good. Perfect, thanks. So yeah, thank you so much. My name is Melissa, like Mindy said, and I'm a fourth year at USC and just here finishing up the whole residency application process, hopefully, fingers crossed, to match next month in March. But I'm really excited that I was invited to talk about some of the experiences I had as a pre-med student, which wasn't always the most positive experience, and kind of trying to handle that and cope with a lot of the imposter syndrome that I faced starting as a pre-med student and even continuing on through my medical school years. So hopefully by sharing this journey with you all, it might help you if you're kind of experiencing similar things. So a little bit about me. I was born and raised in Southern California and about 45 minutes outside of LA. Both my parents are from Mexico though, so I kind of grew up speaking Spanish in my house, hearing stories from them of their childhoods and their little towns in Mexico, and a lot of the lack of healthcare access there. So from a very young age, as you can see in this photo here, I wanted to be a doctor, and it just kind of stuck. And my parents, they've been the biggest source of support for me on this journey, and really were like the main inspiration for me wanting to go to med school. So I really am so grateful to have them. And here they are in this photo, my white coat ceremony. I think, as being an only child, I don't have any siblings. I became pretty self-reliant at a very young age. I couldn't really depend on my parents, at a certain point in my schooling, to help me with my homework or my projects, or, I couldn't really rely on them to help me apply to college. So I became very self-reliant. And in high school, I thought I was very smart. I was like in AP classes, I was on cross country and track, and I was playing the viola in the orchestra, and I was able to handle all those things perfectly fine. And so I thought I was, pretty smart person, and ended up graduating high school in 2014 at the top of my class. But when I went to college in DC, I became the first person in my family to go to college, and a four-year university. And moving across the country to Washington to go to Georgetown was really exciting. I had been to DC once before, but this was kind of a new experience for me, being so far from home, and really being in a new environment with people who came from all over the world. I mean, my first year, my dorm, the Princess of Jordan lived across the hall from me, and her brother, the prince, was also at the school. And people that, were a lot more privileged than I was, and used to a lot of wealth that I wasn't used to, coming from like a low income family. And that's kind of when I first sensed that little bit of imposter syndrome. And I didn't even know that was a term. So like I didn't have a name to put to my feelings yet. So it was a pretty difficult transition. I signed up for 20 credits my first semester as a freshman, and I didn't have anybody that could guide me when I was choosing my classes. So I didn't think 20 credits was out of the ordinary amount of credits that students would take their first year. I come to learn later on that that's a lot more than you should be taking on as a first year freshman. But, I thought I could do it because I had done so well in high school. I didn't expect that this would be so difficult. So I took my first general chemistry exam and I failed. And that was the first time in my life that I'd failed an exam. So as I'm sure you can imagine, that was quite devastating for me. And, the feeling that I was smart and I could do what I wanted to do, and, could make it in this world, really felt like everything was just, came crushing down. And experiencing that sort of failure in my life was quite a new experience. And I had a tough time studying and balancing taking so many courses, and ended up, not doing very well in biology either. So I was here as a, first year pre-med student, with this goal from, the last 12 or 13 years of my life, wanting to become a physician. And so when I went to see my advisor at the end of my first semester, I was quite devastated when they told me that, I probably shouldn't apply to medical school because I wouldn't get in. And that was probably like one of the lowest points in my life, because it was, again, like I felt like this dream that I had and I was working towards all my life was over. And of course, like as a first gen student, in my eyes, this pre-med advisor was the expert. They were being paid, they're hired by this, big university to advise pre-med students. And if they told me that I would never be able to get into med school, I was like, okay, well, I guess they must be right. I have no chance. So I took a semester and just took other courses and learned a lot from that experience. But this was the, really like the peak of the imposter syndrome that I'd ever felt. And I felt like maybe I wasn't good enough to be at a school like Georgetown, that I didn't belong, or, that I'd somehow like fooled admissions committees into thinking that I was good enough to be there, or even like, I was just lucky to be there. Somehow I was able to slide past these, admissions criteria and so on. So it was a pretty bad end to a first semester of college. People say that college is the best time of your life, and that was definitely not my experience. So, I really didn't realize there was a term for that until, Georgetown had a lot of great support for first generation students, and I got to meet many other first gen students who became some of my best friends. And that's when I first started to learn about imposter syndrome and kind of have a word to put to my feelings and my thoughts was like really comforting, because I knew that I wasn't alone in this whole process. So, imposter syndrome, like, think about it. I'm sure many of us have felt it. If you've ever felt like you're a fraud, if you've ever felt like you don't belong or you're not smart enough to be there, you've probably experienced imposter syndrome at some point in your life. And imposter syndrome is really just defined as when you're experiencing thoughts or feelings that you are incompetent, or you don't belong, or you're not smart enough, etc. But really, despite having evidence to the contrary. So these feelings usually have roots in your own personal history and things that you've experienced. And for me, in my example, really was my root in failing my exams and doing so poorly as a first semester student at Georgetown. So that was kind of the start of my imposter syndrome that kind of carries on throughout my college years and through my med school career. But it can really affect someone's, work performance and academic performance in negative ways. And people with imposter syndrome, like I said, it's usually, despite having evidence to the contrary, they have a difficult time attributing their success to things that they've done and the hard work that they've put into what they're doing. And instead really believe that their success is based on luck or other external factors, kind of like how I was describing earlier about my experience at Georgetown. And I think for me too, just kind of learning about how imposter syndrome can really affect minority students and underrepresented students, it's been shown that they tend to have, it's more common, and it's negatively correlated with psychological well-being, and really positively correlated with feelings of depression and anxiety. And so minority students in general already have an increased psychological stress because of, sometimes in college, their financial aid concerns are a big problem. Oftentimes students will have to be working other jobs on top of school to support themselves or support their own families. And discrimination that they can face, and just the fact that a lot of these students are oftentimes first-gen students, is just adds to their burden of these feelings and the stress that they're feeling. So it can disproportionately affect these students, and I certainly felt that myself. And because it just has such a negative impact on our mental well-being and our mental states, it can really impact how you move forward in life and maybe how you approach new challenges in your life. Sometimes I think I even found myself kind of shying away from things that I thought would be very difficult because I wasn't sure I would be able to handle it. And that's why it took me a while to get back on the pre-med track, because I wasn't sure if, I really wanted to, I was sure I wanted to be a doctor, but I was unsure if I would be able to handle it. And when this imposter syndrome isn't addressed, it can turn into this vicious cycle that, is, the imposter syndrome cycle. You start kind of with this fear of inadequacy, and it turns into overcompensating by working really hard, studying really hard. And I found myself doing this a lot as a pre-med and as a med student, is feeling like you had to do this. That's kind of the sense of control that I had in my life, was how much work I could do to, do well and overcome these feelings, but it leads to a lot of burnout and anxiety and depression. And, but then when you do well in an exam or do well in a class or presentation, you get that sense of accomplishment, and you get that, it's very transient sense of accomplishment. You are proud. And then you kind of get back into this cycle again. And it's really hard to, at least for me, it was really hard to kind of break away from that cycle. And it was something that I think was even for me personally a lot stronger, and something that I felt more when I was a medical student. And so I know this presentation is a lot of focus on the pre-med journey, and I think for me, it was important for me to kind of share, like in medical school, this is also something that I experienced and something I wish maybe I would have prepared for a little bit more, to kind of make that transition easier that first year. I think as pre-meds, we, at least for me, I was so focused on just getting into med school. I kind of didn't even think past that really initially. So I think hopefully just by sharing a little bit about what the med school experience is like will be helpful for you when you're trying to navigate maybe some of the imposter syndrome feelings that you're having when you start med school. But yeah, throughout all 4 years of med school, I've had a lot of imposter syndrome. In my preclinical years, when you're just studying and having lectures and taking exams, I felt like I had to prove to myself and prove to other people that I was worthy of being at that med school. And applying to med school with a lower GPA, and like in my case, I felt like I really had to prove my worthiness of being there. Because again, I felt like maybe it was just lucky that I had gotten into USC, which was my dream school, my dream medical school, because I wanted to be back in LA close to family. I really liked the curriculum and working with county patients and underserved population, Spanish-speaking patients. So it was like a dream school for me. So when I got in, it was really hard to believe. And, of course, that person and my advisor was always in the back of my mind. So I felt like I had to overcompensate by studying a lot as a first-year med student. And this even rang true when I was studying for Step 1, which is one of the first national board exams you take as a medical student. There's 3 of them, and the first one you take kind of before you start your rotations. I didn't exercise. I really neglected that part of things that I enjoyed in my life. I really enjoyed running. I had run cross country and track almost all my life. So those are things that I neglected because I felt like I didn't have the time to do that. I would visit my parents a lot in my first year of med school, but when it came time to Step 1, I said, okay, I'm not going to visit you. And they would just see me for like 15 minutes on the weekend to drop off groceries, which, they're such a big source of support for me. It was not the right thing to do, obviously, to neglect them in that way. But that's what I felt like I had to do well and to prove to myself that I could pass this exam. And then, my boyfriend, he lived in San Diego, and we would often try and see each other once or twice a month. And this was a 6.5-week period that I was studying, and I told him that he couldn't visit me that whole period because I felt like it would be a distraction. But he was a source of support for me too. And I think I really just, again, had these feelings that kept me from staying true to myself. And then, ultimately that really impacted my mental and physical health during this time. Losing a lot of hair, and I actually lost a lot of weight. It was not a good place to be. And so I definitely don't recommend doing that. But it's like in that moment, you kind of can't think of anything else. So I know what that's like. And then in my clinical years, it didn't get much better. It was nice when I passed Step 1 because I felt like, okay, I did it. I got that transient sense of success and accomplishment. And even though when I took the exam, I left the exam center feeling like I didn't pass, of course, because that's kind of how I always feel after every exam. You move on to the clinical period in med school, and there's a lot of different kinds of stressors put on you. Instead of, you having all the control of how much you can study and how you do on an exam, a lot of your clinical years is based on evaluations that you get from people that you work with. So, in different rotations, like here's my surgery rotation, which was really fun, but, I didn't want to go into surgery, but I felt like I still had to show up every day, interested in the cases we were doing and prepared for each case, just in case I was asked a question by the attending or by a resident. I didn't want them to think that I was dumb or that I didn't belong or that I wasn't worthy of being a med student there learning with them. So I, again, kind of overcompensated in this way, and hours are long on clinical rotations. Surgery hours for me is like, I would have 28-hour shifts. Most of the time they were like 15 hours. So I'd get home, have to eat really quickly, and then go back to doing my practice questions so I could do well on the exam, and also so that I knew the material. And this caused a lot of burnout, also just like a lot of anxiety. It was the first time, I think med school for me was the first time that I really experienced like true anxiety, especially when it was the start of a new rotation. I felt so nervous about all the unknowns that comes with a new rotation, and felt like rotations are hard because you have generally like 4 to 6 weeks in one specialty. And the beginning is always really difficult. And then you kind of start to get the hang of it that second, third, and fourth week. But then it's time to switch again. And so it seems like you can never really get to a good place where you feel comfortable. And so that also played a big role into the imposter syndrome that I was feeling. And on clinical rotations, it's really easy to compare yourself to other students because you're working a lot of times in teams with your fellow classmates. And, I love my fellow classmates. They're amazing. And I think part of the reason why overall med school was just such a more positive experience was because, my classmates were so supportive, and it was a very collaborative environment versus, my pre-med classmates weren't as supportive and collaborative. So I think med school overall, I loved, and I think was way better than being a pre-med student. But it's really easy to compare yourself in these moments when you're kind of put on the spot and asked a question by and attending a resident, and you don't know it, and then your classmate does know it. And so it's like, you're like, dang, I wish I would have known that. I should have studied more. I should have, and in reality, it's, you're not going to know everything. That's just kind of how life is. No doctor knows everything. And you kind of forget that in those moments. And I was really hard on myself because of that. And then now just applying to residency this year, I think I was nervous. I wasn't sure like how that was going to go, but I was really ignoring a lot of this evidence I had to support my application and to kind of negate these feelings of being an imposter. I never failed an exam in medical school, so that was like something I worried about going into med school, is how I was able to pass all my exams. And I honored multiple rotations, and I tended to forget about that every time I started a new one, because it kind of felt like a whole new world. And I always told myself like, okay, yeah, I was just lucky I honored that rotation. It just turned out to be better than I expected. And, I never really attributed it to my hard work. And, I think, yeah, I struggled to feel like I was very smart. In reality, I think I just tended to focus on the negatives of things. And when I was elected to the Honor Society at my medical school, again, I've kind of shied away from, I told my parents, but I kind of downplayed it. I told a couple of my friends, but again, I downplayed it because people who aren't in medicine don't really know what it is. And it was funny because somebody came over to our house who was familiar with what this honor society was, and they saw the plaque on my parents' wall, and they were like, whoa, like you honor society. Wow, it's amazing. And my parents were like, wait, what? Like, well, Melissa didn't tell us it was such a big deal. And I was like, yeah, no, like, I got it. But I think, it just, I don't understand, I was just lucky, I guess. And again, kind of just downplaying my success because I didn't feel like it was because of my own, labor and my hard work. I felt like it was some sort of external factors that I had no control over. So it was, I went to med school with the goal of just passing and surviving because that's all I wanted as a pre-med student. And in actuality, I ended up doing a lot better than I expected, but it was the imposter syndrome that really kept me from seeing those wins along the way. And something that I wish that I would have kind of been better at dealing with. sooner rather than later. And so when there was a point in my medical school journey, and it really was towards the end of my clinical rotations, that the imposter syndrome for me personally was getting to be quite difficult to manage and handle on my own. And I'm really grateful that my med school has a lot of supportive services for med students, because they know how difficult it can be. And I turned to one of the people on staff that are there to help the medical students during difficult times. And she was able to recommend to me a therapist who did a few sessions with me, kind of like just problem solving sessions, very focused on this imposter syndrome that I was feeling, because it was leading to a lot of anxiety for me. I was having issues sleeping, and that was not something I've ever experienced before. So one of the biggest things that I learned in these sessions that has helped me a lot is really looking, I kind of already talked about this, that like looking at the evidence that you have and the reality that exists, and reminding yourself, especially when you're kind of feeling these thoughts of feeling like an imposter and you don't belong, reminding yourself of the evidence to negate those thoughts and feelings. And so during our few sessions, I talked about, feeling like people were going to figure out that I wasn't smart enough to be there. And she's like, okay, well, like, what evidence do you have to support that you aren't smart enough to be there? And I said, I guess I passed my exams, and I guess I've done well on rotations. Okay, so like maybe I don't really have evidence to support that. And there's no like real reasoning behind this. It's just kind of this weird thought and feeling that comes to my mind without any support of evidence. So that really helped me kind of reframe my thoughts and give me that new perspective. And it's something that I really like to do, moving forward. Since then, I've been able to really use that in my times when I've had really difficult imposter syndrome. And I think also kind of trying to get to the root of these feelings is very important. And that's something else that we talked about in these sessions. And for me, ultimately it came down to my pre-med experience. Like that pre-med experience really did a number on me. And so it's kind of infiltrated many of my thoughts and feelings since this was 2014. So almost basically 10 years ago now. And it seems to have really just stuck with me. And because I kind of let it, these feelings and this experience affect me in ways for so long, I think it will take a lot of time to be able to best deal with the imposter syndrome. But I think it's definitely helped me being able to look at the evidence and remind myself that these feelings don't have any base in reality. And becoming more self-aware of these thoughts is really helpful too. I think it's easy in those moments to kind of get into that negative cycle, at least for me. And it's important that you kind of take a step back and remind yourself that these are thoughts that are, not based in reality. It's also really helpful for me to get perspective from other people. So getting this perspective from this therapist in those few sessions was nice. And then just talking about it with my partner or my parents, they're always really helpful and reminding me of my ability to get past some of these things that I've struggled with before, and that I'll be able to overcome these things in the future. And as much as I wish like I didn't experience imposter syndrome, or that I could get rid of it altogether, I know that it's not going to be possible. I think if anything, I know I'm probably going to feel a lot of imposter syndrome when I transition to residency and I become a physician. And that pressure to take care of people is really, is on you. And it's the first time in my life that I'll be feeling that sort of responsibility. As a med student, you take part in the care of patients, but it's not really ultimately your responsibility. And as a resident, it's that's a whole new challenge. And I know for me personally, I will be feeling a lot of imposter syndrome. And I think I know for sure that although it's going to be difficult, I have to remind myself of these skills that I've used in the past to get over these feelings and to help me along the way. And interestingly, during my residency interviews, I talked a lot about imposter syndrome. And when people would ask me what's something that's been difficult to handle and like something that you might think will be difficult to handle as a resident, that was always my answer. And I think it was really nice to hear from physicians at these programs that they also had imposter syndrome and they still have imposter syndrome. So despite them being physicians for years and decades, it's still something that you experience like every step along your journey. So the earlier you kind of get a handle on these feelings and gain these skills that will help you in the future along your journey, wherever you may be on that journey, it's really helpful. So if you feel like you ever feel like these imposter syndrome feelings are getting in the way of your personal life and your academic life, consider trying some of these things that have been helpful for me. And I just, it's kind of a short and sweet presentation, but wanted to end on a good note here and really just say that, si se puede, I was able to get to this point, not really believing in myself, but, if I can do it, you can do it too. And I wish that as a pre-med student, someone had told me that, and also told me that you don't need to get a 4.0 GPA to get into med school. You don't need like a 520 MCAT, or I don't even know what the scores are anymore. But you don't need to be the top in academics, and med schools really just want to see who you are as a person and continue being those good people that you are, because that's needed in medicine. And especially important I think for me personally, like underrepresented students to hear this message, because you are really needed in medicine, and you can tell what a difference it makes with patients when you have that shared lived experience and that shared language. And it's really rewarding. So, really hang in there. I wish you guys all the best, because I know that this is a difficult journey, but you can do it, because I did it. And then I always kind of end these presentations with some resources that I really thought were helpful for me when I was applying. PreMed CC was not something I knew about when I was a pre-med student, but I follow you on Instagram and I see all the amazing events that you host. So definitely make sure that you tap into that resource. Mi Mentor is another app or website that I used a lot when I was a pre-med student, just connecting with other students who are pre-health, and then connecting with physicians who are really happy to help with interview preparation, and got to do like a mock MMI with Mi Mentor in person at the time because it was pre-pandemic. And also social media is such a big, I think, resource now. Personally for me, I get lots of messages from students every day asking me questions, and it's really fun to be able to answer them in my DMs, or sometimes I'll even like coordinate a phone call or a Zoom call with them to really help them on their own journeys and answer their questions. So reach out to me or to any other med students that you kind of see on social media, because a lot of them are more than happy to help. And then lastly, something that I wish when I was a pre-med student that I did was connect with some of these student groups that exist at medical schools around the country. And, this includes Latino Medical Student Association, the SNMA, the Student National Medical Association, APAMSA, which is the Asian Pacific American Medical Student Association, and AMWA, which is the American Women Medical Association. So all of these organizations typically have a student organization at a med school. So if there's a med school near you, you can find their Instagram accounts. I know personally my school, all these organizations have their own Instagram accounts, and you could just message them and see if they have any events or if they have any mentorship programs that you can take part in and meet other medical students who can help you on your journey. So yeah, that's all I have for today. Thanks for listening. It was kind of a big long rant about my experience as a pre-med and as a med student, but hopefully it was helpful, and happy to answer any questions now.
Awesome. It's a really great presentation. Learned a lot. So thank you. First question. Okay. If you struggled in any pre-med courses like OChem and didn't perform as well as you hoped, how did you navigate through that? Did you feel like this career wasn't for you? Negative thoughts? Currently struggling?
Yes, totally. Definitely struggled, especially like OChem for sure. Um, I think by the time that I took organic chemistry, it was by then that I learned how important it was to ask for help. So that first semester when I failed chemistry, I did not go to professor office hours. As a first year, I was really nervous about meeting my professors and talking to them. I think I was afraid, again, that I would go to their office hours and they would ask me questions, and I would feel like an imposter because I wouldn't know what they were asking me about, or I would feel like really dumb in their presence. And that really kept me from asking for help. So when I finally realized that importance my second year, that's when I started going to professor office hours, despite being really nervous to go. I remember like my heart was racing and I was standing outside their door waiting for my turn. It was a really scary experience, but it also was a great way to make connections with the professors. Oftentimes these classes are really big and it's hard to make those connections. And later on, you need letters of recommendation for medical school. So, for example, like my physiology professor was also my biochemistry professor. And so when I took 2 of his courses, I made sure to go to his office hours, and he got to know me as a person outside of school and academics. And he ended up writing a really nice letter for me. And I think it really made a difference when I was applying to med school. And yeah, I think if you're not already kind of taking advantage of going to professor office hours, really put yourself out there and do that. I did feel kind of part to the other part of the question is I definitely felt like this career wasn't for me. Even when I decided to be back on the pre-med track, it was still a very difficult experience. It wasn't a smooth ride. And what really helped me in those times was going back to my why, medicine, what really inspired me initially to go into medicine. And that was like people and patients. And oftentimes as a pre-med student, we're so bogged down by trying to get the best grades and trying to get through these weed out classes that, really in the end, yes, it's important information, but as a med student, I never use organic chemistry personally. I never used physics. And so these things are feels like just things you have to get through to get to this end goal. So remind yourself of why you initially wanted to go into medicine. And for me, it was really easy. I volunteered at a free clinic for many years before college at my hometown. And every summer when I went home or during breaks in school, like winter break, I went back to the clinic and got to work with patients and help doctors and do all these things that really inspired me to be a physician in the first place. So if you have something like that in your life, I highly recommend you kind of still make time for it, despite maybe feeling like there's not time for anything outside of school. It's important to kind of still give yourself that space to live a life outside of school and being a pre-med student. But yeah, thanks for the question. Hopefully that was helpful.
Hi, Melissa. Thank you so much for the presentation. Our next one is, did you experience any toxicities such as like over competitiveness or negative comments as an undergrad? But basically in Melissa's like entire presentation, she was kind of like talking about that toxicity. And so I think like maybe how did that change as an undergrad to med student? Like, did any of your strategies change in terms of how you try to overcome that imposter syndrome?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yes, I mean, I definitely experienced a lot of toxicity as a pre-med student. I think every school has different pre-med culture, and unfortunately at the time when I was at my college, it was quite cutthroat, and I didn't feel like I could really, none of my friends were pre-med students. I guess that if that tells you anything. And I think it's quite an isolating experience, but really to get through that, it would help me was just, having those friends who really were big support systems for me, people who I could connect with on things outside of school. I said that a lot of my friends were first-gen students, children who were, whose parents were immigrants as well. And for me personally, that wasn't something that I was able to really connect with other people in my life when I was in high school, because I grew up in a very non-diverse suburb of LA. And it wasn't until college, when I was around a very diverse group of people, that I got to explore that part of my identity. And I was so grateful for that, because I kind of felt more understood by my friends in college. So that was really nice. And in med school, I think in general, from what I've heard and people's experience, it tends to be a lot better of an experience in being a pre-med. Everybody's in med school at that point, and I think we all kind of just want to get through it together. So there's a lot more collaboration and support. My first year was 2020, so it was, peak pandemic, and it was not the way that I expected to start medical school, but we made the most of it and shared our flashcards, and people shared notes that they took. And it was really nice to feel supported by my classmates. And I think just by nature of being away from that feeling to be the best and always do the best as a pre-med student, med school is a lot easier, especially if you go to a pass-fail medical school. I believe that makes a big difference too. So if you're applying to medical school, definitely look into that. It made a huge difference for me personally, just feeling like I had to do enough just to pass, knowing, you don't have to know every single thing that could potentially come up on an exam. It really, helps with your mental health. So highly recommend you look into that.
All right, next question. How to navigate the feelings of not feeling ready for the MCAT?
Yes, I don't think I would ever have felt ready for the MCAT, to be honest. So just kind of go into this feeling like you're never going to feel ready to take the MCAT, because there is so many things on the exam. But what is really helpful is to, again, kind of look at the evidence and look at your practice exam scores. If you're passing your practice exams, then there you go. Like you kind of get a sense of how you will do on the actual exam day. And for me personally, I did better on my MCAT than I was doing on my practice exams. You never know what kind of questions you're going to be asked that day. Maybe it's something that you're really good at. Also, I think the adrenaline of the exam day kind of gets you through it. And just trust, all the hard work that you've put into studying for the exam. If you haven't already, I think practice questions are very, very important as you study for the MCAT. I know I didn't really focus on that when I studied for the MCAT. I did too much passive review and left all the practice questions and practice exams to the very end. And the MCAT, I did okay. Like I was close to the national average. So I think that helped me when I applied, when I had a low GPA. But I probably could have done a lot better if I would have known about like UWorld or Anki or, all these question banks that people use these days. I didn't know about those when I was a pre-med student. So looking back, I would have done things differently. But either way, if I was taking the MCAT back then or now, I don't think I would ever feel ready. Just like I don't think I ever felt ready to take any of my step 1 or step 2 exams as a med student. But it works out and things, end up being okay.
Our next question is, how is your general experience, relationships with your professors as a first generation student? And how were you able to get those like strong letters of recommendation for medical school? Maybe like where should you look for these types of professors?
Yeah, that was the hardest thing for me, was getting letters of recommendation, because I was so shy and I was so nervous to talk to my professors. There were some professors who were a lot more open to getting to know me outside of school. Kind of like I mentioned, my physiology and biochem professor. He took an interest in learning more about me, and he could really see that I was trying hard in his classes. And I think, he liked to hear, my story, and it was nice to be able to feel like I could share that with the professor. And even people who weren't, my science professors, I had a history professor who I really enjoyed his class and would go to his office hours just to get feedback on, my essays and I think it really helped, despite, it wasn't a science professor, but it's a professor who could write you a letter of recommendation in the future. Because you do need usually one non-science professor. So keep that in mind too, is, if you see like there's a professor that you really enjoy their class, even just going to their office hours and complimenting them on their passion for teaching or the way that they're teaching, is a great start, even if you don't have questions. But yeah, it's as a first gen student, I think if you're just upfront with that is really nice. I think they're always really receptive to helping students most of the time. And if you're honest and say, hey, I'm a first gen student, I don't have anybody in my family who has ever taken organic chemistry. I think they totally understand. And I remember when I went to my organic chemistry professor's office hours, I was very nervous. But he was an immigrant himself. So I think it was kind of nice to share my background and hear his experience, and we were able to connect over that. So you never know what kind of things you'll connect with over with the professor. Just, I think most importantly, be yourself and be authentic to who you are and what your life experiences have been. And I think that really shows professors things that help them write a really strong letter of recommendation, because they'll it's the letters of recommendation. Yeah, they're going to talk about your strengths as a student, but also his strengths as a person. And that, I think, to me is more important to medical school admissions, is kind of seeing who you are outside of just being a student.
All right, next question. Did you self-report as disadvantaged when applying to medical school? If so, could you elaborate on your decision? If not, what does it look like to be a disadvantaged student?
Yeah. So I think now, correct me if I'm wrong, there's something called like an impactful experience essay or something like that. So it's not the disadvantage essay anymore. But when I applied, yes. And I think there's like a whole definition that the AAMC has out there that can kind of help guide you to think about if you feel like you want to write something about your experience, your life experiences, to share a little bit more about you outside of what admissions people see through your grades and through your scores and through your personal statement. But yes, I personally did write a statement, and I wrote about, I made my statement as people encouraged me to be very matter of fact. And it wasn't like, I didn't write it to be like a pity party to like have people feel bad for me. It's really just to share honestly and truthfully like what you've experienced as a person and how that impacted you. So for me, I wrote about being a first gen student. I wrote about coming from a low income family, and how that impacted me. I had to be very self-reliant at a very young age. My mom worked at a gas station like overnight, and it was up to my dad to like help me in the mornings for school. We lived in a garage for a lot of my childhood. So like these things, I think at the time as a child, I didn't really like know what was going on. I lived a wonderful life in my head. I loved, my parents. I loved the life that we lived. But I think looking back, it did impact my life in ways that I didn't realize. So I wrote about first gen, being low income, and what else? I think those are the two things that I focus on. And like having to work in high school. I worked as a tutor, and I also worked in college. I worked three part-time jobs. And I also worked a couple of part-time jobs while I was applying for med school and studying for the MCAT. So those are things that you should highlight, because it does kind of show a different side to you as an applicant, and kind of like the resilience that you have, and trying to get over these difficult moments in your life, because those are skills that are so important as a med student, because you will have difficult times in med school, and as a physician, and those are really good skills to have.
All right, so next question is, can you talk more about your medical school process experience, like if you took any gap years, or when you started studying while you're still learning at school?
Yes. I took 2 gap years, and I highly recommend taking gap years. I think most people that I talk to now are taking gap years, so it seems to be the more common route, versus people who are going straight through. But when I was a pre-med student, I thought that taking gap years was like a reflection of like my inability to do well in school. And later on, it was when I kind of spoke to more people about their experiences during their gap years that it really is actually just such a beneficial part of like a pre-med journey. I think I was very grateful for that because it gave me time to kind of step back and save up money for applications and take the time to study for the MCAT, because I knew personally I would have not been able to study for the MCAT on top of all my classes in college, and on top of working and all of those things. And for me, I knew that the MCAT was going to be a big, kind of like not a deal breaker, but I knew it was going to be something important because of my lower GPA. I know somebody's also asked about my GPA, and I can share my GPA was a 3.238. So that's my GPA when I applied to med school, which I think if I would have known as a pre-med student that it was possible to get into med school with the GPA like that, it would have given me a lot more hope. It would have probably kept me from spending all my money and applying to like 40 schools instead of really narrowing it down to schools that would have, really where I thought I had like a chance, So I think I lost my train of thought, but the MCAT was important for me personally because of my lower GPA. So in studying for the MCAT, I got a scholarship from my school when I graduated for pre-med like resource stuff. And so I took a class called the Berkeley Review. It was an in-person course by UCLA. I don't think it's around anymore, sadly, because of the pandemic, but it was a really good class. And was a great way of, like, they taught well and they taught concepts well. But I think looking back, I don't even think a class is necessary. I think, like I said earlier, doing practice questions is really key. So if you can get your hands on a subscription to one of the question banks that exist out there, that would be really helpful. I know I use UWorld for all of my board exams as a med student. And if you set a goal to get through all the questions and to do questions every day, making flashcards for things that you keep getting wrong or things that you miss, and review those flashcards every day, that's how I was able to pass step 1 and do pretty well on step 2. And it's easier said than done. I know that I would feel most comfortable doing like reviewing and watching videos and reading textbooks and review books and all those things, but challenging yourself with questions will teach you a lot when you read those answer explanations, and that's kind of content review in and of itself. So if you're not already doing that, highly recommend doing that for your MCAT prep.
On the topic of MCAT, how do you navigate studying for the MCAT while you're doing other activities like working full time, doing pre-med related stuff?
Yes. It was hard. For me, like I was working a couple of part-time jobs when I was studying for the MCAT. I'm really thankful that those part-time jobs were really flexible with the hours and when I would do the work. They were mostly remote, and I could kind of make my own schedule. So I tried to schedule out my days and usually study 5 to 6 days a week, giving myself a break on one of those days. And I usually try to study for at least 3 to 5 hours a day. And it could have been like in the morning, afternoon, whenever I thought I could find the time to kind of sit there and take that time. For me, I think also it was helpful to find like a good place to study. I'm somebody who likes to go to a coffee shop, and that's just who I am. I think like having the people around me makes me focus more. Whereas some people might think that's a distraction. It's to kind of find the place that suits you and what helps you. But it was nice for me to have that separation from my home and where I was studying and where I was working too, so that I could kind of feel like when I was in a coffee shop that I would go to, they like knew my name by the time I finished the MCAT, basically. So when I was there, I knew I was there to study for the MCAT and to really get that done. I didn't have like an MCAT study buddy, but I think that's really helpful sometimes, just having somebody there who you can talk to and check in with, and ask yourselves like how things are going, and if you're having any issues with anything. It's always nice to have somebody there with you. But yes, it's hard to balance, but I think scheduling your time, I use Google Calendar a lot and just would study out block out time each day for my studying and my work. And that was helpful for me to balance everything. And if you know that it's going to be difficult to do that, just give yourself more time to study for the MCAT. There's no reason you need to like, study for 3 months. Like you can study for 6 months, but just know that it's going to be a longer time to study, and maybe it'll lead to some more burnout or exhaustion or whatever. So be really mindful when you're studying, and check in with yourself to make sure that you aren't feeling burnt out. Give yourself the time that you need to relax and get that time outside of studying.
We don't have any more questions in the chat, but I do have a question about going back to the topic of like getting like letters of rec from professors. When did you decide was a good time to ask for the letters of rec? Like after you took the class with them, or like later on when you were about to apply for med school? And like how did you like store it in any place? Maybe like any advice on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that like I said, the hardest part for me applying to med school, I think, was letters of rec, because it's felt like it's confusing. Like you said, like where do you send them? Where do you store them? If I remember correctly, I used Interfolio, and that was, I think, something that people told me was really helpful for them when they were asking for letters and storing them. In terms of when to ask for them, I think it's best to ask if you're going to regular office hours towards the end of the semester. If you feel comfortable asking in person, I think that's always best. Just say, hey, even if it's like your sophomore year of college, you can always just say, I plan to apply to med school in the future. Would you be okay, writing a letter of recommendation for me? And a lot of the times I'm sure they'll say yes if you feel like you have that good connection with the professor. And you can kind of maybe even just give them the option of, you can write the letter now and send it to me later, or because I think if they write it then, it's probably a better, stronger letter instead of waiting a couple years or whatever, how many years you have to wait before your application. But I actually like never did that because I wasn't bold enough or like brave enough to ask for these letters when I was in professor office hours, except for that one professor I kind of mentioned that I had a stronger connection with. I took 2 gap years, so I think it was hard for me to kind of go back in time and ask these professors for letters. So I really wish I would have I tried to stay connected with them by like sending them update emails. So one of my like English professors who wrote a letter for me, he was like, he was so nice, and I loved him as a professor. So I felt comfortable like sending him emails, once or twice a year, updating him with like things in my life. And it was really nice for him, I think, and also for me to stay connected that way. So that's a way that you can do that. Especially if you're going to be taking gap years. It's important to stay connected, because you don't want to have to email a professor out of nowhere and say, hey, do you remember me? Like that's probably not going to be the best letter of recommendation. So the earlier you make these connections, the better. Honestly, I think that's something I wish I would have known sooner as a pre-med student. I know some people will ask me to, I took like 3 or 4 gap years and I haven't really stayed connected with my professors. Like, what should I do? And that's a really tough situation, because I think in an ideal world, like I would say like take a class at a local college or university, and try to get a letter from somebody there who you've worked with more recently. But I know that's like sometimes cost prohibitive, and like it's a lot more time and money and things that not all of us can do. And so I'd say, the best you can do, I guess, is just reach out to people that you worked with, and make sure you send them your resume and some other things to hopefully give them a sense of who you are. But it is a difficult part of the application process. I think it is hard, but the earlier you start, kind of making those connections, the better.
And to kind of like follow up with that, when you sent them like email, or like when you're requesting your letter of rec, did you like attach like your resume and like guidelines? I know that on like I think on the AMC website, there's like some guidelines maybe, or like I remember seeing somewhere that there's like guidelines for writing the letter of rec. So did you attach like transcript, resume, and like maybe that guidelines list, or what kinds of like things would you think is like most helpful in like helping them write?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. a lot of these professors are probably used to writing letters of recommendation for pre-med students, especially like the science professors, but it's always nice to, I think, submit them so that there's like a general guideline. I also included a rough draft of my personal statement. A lot of times, like it was a very, very rough draft because I asked my letter writers in like February of the year I applied. So it was still very early on, but I wanted to make sure that I had enough time to like secure, people to agree to write me a letter and then give them a lot of time to write it too. So I think asking in like February or March is a good time. And including a rough draft of your personal statement and activities and like resume, CV, all those things will be very helpful so that they can get a general sense of like what your theme of your application is. So like mine was a lot of helping underserved populations, and that was a big theme in my personal statement and in my activities that I did. So I think my letter writers were, I didn't see all of my letters. So I don't know what they wrote about, but I can probably imagine that they wrote about my interest in serving these communities, and just based on like my life experiences and things that I've told and shared with them. And something I did for my residency application letters, I kind of went a little step further, and I saw somebody online share something that they did was kind of write like an about me page type of thing. And I just, in bullet points, shared like 10 things about myself that I thought were really important to me and probably important to highlight. Not all the time do you have the ability to share parts of your life with people you work with. So like for me, with the attendings that I worked with, sometimes I only worked with them for a few weeks at a time. But here they were, trying to support me and write a letter. So I wanted them to get to know me more outside of medicine, and I sent them this kind of about me page. So it's also something that you can consider if you feel like submitting your rough draft personal statement doesn't share not enough about you. I think that's always helpful too, is to kind of just, the more information you give them, like, can't hurt them or hurt you in your letter writing. So yeah.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. Does anyone left in the room have any other questions? Any last ones for Melissa?
Yeah, if you guys have any other questions, put it in the chat. The other thing is I was going to ask is, what did you do for your living situation in undergrad and med school, and how did you find that? How did you find that to work for you or not work for you?
Yeah. So at Georgetown, students are required to live on campus for 3 out of the 4 years. So I ended up just living on campus all 4 years. Thankfully, I got a scholarship at Georgetown. It wasn't a full ride, but it was a pretty big substantial scholarship that really helped me pay for most of my housing and tuition costs. But it was able to supplement that with the work that I was doing there. Like I was doing like random jobs, like walking a dog, and I was a exam proctor at the business school, and I worked as like a music assistant at the chapel on campus. So like a lot of little random things, but like it added up. So that was really nice. And then for med school, I lived in like campus student housing kind of. That was like right near the med school, and that was the more expensive option. But for me, I think I really valued the convenience of not having to commute. And it was really nice when like I had to be at the hospital at like 4:30 in the morning that I could just walk, like, 4 minutes to the hospital. And so it's kind of up to you how much you value different things. And for me, convenience was a big part of living near campus. But the downside of that was, yes, it was very expensive. I had to take out more loans than typical. And it was not like, it was kind of like a food desert. There weren't many grocery stores. There weren't many like restaurants around there. So that was kind of the downside. But for me, ultimately, it was the better choice for me personally. And some students don't really care so much about the convenience. They don't care about the commute. So they'll live somewhere else that's a little bit more affordable. So it's kind of whatever floats your boat and what's important to you.
All right, I see some questions in the chat, so it's just kind of like a spam again. So our next one is, how many times did you take the MCAT? And then while you're studying, what kind of job did you do on the side?
Yeah, great question. The jobs that I had when I was studying for the MCAT were I was working part-time as a marketing assistant for a sunscreen company, which was like very random. But it was like through a connection with alumni from my school. And like her friend had a sunscreen company and they needed help with their marketing. And as like, a younger student, they figured like I could use Instagram, and I was probably a lot more tech savvy than they were in that way. So it was really easy to uh, do that for me, and it was nice to get paid for it. And it was kind of fun. Like I was an art minor in college, so I really enjoyed like graphic design and kind of using that part of my brain. And it was nice to kind of balance that out with like all the other stuff that I was doing to study for the MCAT. And the other job I had was a capital campaign assistant. So basically helping a nonprofit, which was the free clinic that I volunteered for previously. They hired me after I graduated from college to help them with a fundraising campaign that they were doing to raise money for a new building. So it was quite a big like fundraising goal, and it was really interesting to see that side of medicine in like nonprofits. And it was something that I actually like talked a lot about in my interviews. They seemed to be like really curious about that job, and it was a nice kind of conversation. Not starter, but like things that I could talk about in my interviews. So it's definitely something unique.
Yeah, I know if you're like a little bit Instagram or social media savvy, I know like a lot of doctor groups are hiring college students to manage their Instagram, also nonprofit student organizations, I mean nonprofit organizations. And now since it's an election year, uh, campaigns as well. So if you are any savvy at that stuff, that's like a great way to get into a lot of like good opportunities because most people that are over the age of, I don't know, 20, I mean 30, over the age of 30 are not Instagram or social media savvy. So that's a good way to 30 or 40, I don't know. Some people are just not. So
Yeah. And it's like so fun to use like Canva or like those other really fun sites to just like make fun designs. So yeah, highly recommend.
All right, next question. How did you decide in your specialty, and did your background identity as a first generation influence your decision?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I was a psychology major in college, so I already kind of had an interest in psychiatry, but all of my experiences as a pre-med student, like shadowing and volunteering, was in like a family medicine primary care clinic setting. So when I went to med school, I was pretty sure that I wanted to do family medicine. And that was mostly because I felt like I could make the most impact. I felt like, as a general doctor, like everybody has to kind of go to you first, and then you can go to, gets referred to a specialist. And I kind of wanted to be that first point of contact for patients, especially for me, kind of like my first generation background, but really just, being a daughter of immigrants. I thought it'd be really nice to kind of be like a provider that I wish my parents had, somebody who could speak their language and know their culture and really connect with them in those ways. So for me, I thought that I could do that through family medicine. And it wasn't until like my third year rotations when I did my psychiatry rotation that I really realized how much I loved it. And it was the only rotation that like I actually really loved in the end. Family medicine was great, but I realized it was like not really my cup of tea. It's so broad and generalized that to me it was kind of overwhelming. Family medicine doctors have to know a lot about a lot of different things, and it's like they're amazing at what they do. And it also, I felt like psychiatry was fit more of my personality. I think I tend to be like a listener. I'm very introverted. So like even doing something like this makes me very nervous if you can't tell. But I think being a psychiatrist, it's like your goal is to really listen and get to know somebody's story and to help them. And it was the only rotation where I felt like we actually got the time that we needed to get to know patients on a deeper level versus in a lot of other specialties that I rotated through, especially like in outpatient settings, you get like 15 minutes with the patient, which is like nothing. And in family medicine, patients will come in with lots of concerns naturally because I know patients, it's hard to see your doctor to schedule an appointment. It's also expensive sometimes with expensive copays. So when you go, you kind of want to get a lot of things, figured out. And that's not always possible in a 15-minute conversation. So I really enjoyed that side of psychiatry, is that it's a lot more time and you get to know your patients, I felt like, in a lot better, more like deeper level. So, and it's really nice, I think, too, because there are not a lot of, first of all, not a lot of Latino and Latina physicians in general, but in psychiatry, it's even less. And there are patients, of course, there's a lot of mental health stigma that exists in many communities, but I definitely have noticed it in my own like family, and then also in the Latino and Spanish speaking communities that I've worked with as a med student. So I'm hoping that by using my experience, growing up in this culture, growing up with parents who do have like that mental health stigma, will kind of help me navigate conversations with patients and hopefully get them better care. But it wasn't an easy decision. My parents initially were not very thrilled with my decision to become a psychiatrist. Like I said, there is a lot of stigma that exists, and they felt like, maybe psychiatrists like weren't real doctors. Like it's like definitely what people think sometimes. And it was ultimately they're very supportive now, but it took a lot of conversations and kind of sharing what a psychiatrist does, and the fact that they yes, they are doctors, and they do, as some psychiatrists do see a lot of medical things too. So psychiatric medications can affect people's liver and kidneys and all these things. So you do have to know a lot of medicine still. But I think some people don't realize that. And so, yeah, I think ultimately I'm very happy with my decision. Psychiatry is a great specialty. It needs a lot more diversity, just like a lot of other specialties too. And I think I was limiting myself initially by saying I want to be a family medicine doctor because I thought that would make the most impact. But every specialty needs diverse physician providers. And I think definitely don't limit yourself because you feel like primary care is the only place that needs these types of people, if that makes sense.
All right. So our next question, the student appears to want to go into a nursing program, and so they're wondering if they should look into nursing jobs or programs while they're taking any prerequisite classes and going through the training workforce before she goes into a nursing career.
Yeah, I don't know too much about nursing, but I think it's always nice to kind of get a general sense of what you will be doing. If you want to ultimately become a nurse, then I know people who become certified nurse assistants and kind of work on the side and get that work experience while they're taking courses to become a nurse. If your ultimate goal is to become a physician, I know people in college who majored in nursing. I mean, we're in the nursing school at Georgetown. Instead of majoring in biology or psychology like I did, they were able to graduate in 4 years with a bachelor's in nursing, and they still applied to med school later on. And I think it's kind of nice. I know I've seen nurses go on to medical school and decide to pursue that path, and they have amazing experience. Nurses have so much hospital experience, and they know a lot about patient care, and it's a kind of a good, nice perspective to have if that's something you want to do before medical school. But yeah, I think in any kind of job, if there's a way to kind of get in that work environment to get a sense of what you'll be doing, like getting shadowing or clinical hours, it's always nice to kind of get an idea of what you're getting yourself into. And of course, I think as a pre-med student, we feel a lot of pressure to be involved in lots of things like extracurriculars and shadowing and volunteering and research and all these things. But ultimately, the most important thing I think as a pre-med student is doing well in your classes. There's always time later on in gap years to get all these clinical hours and, you know, get that experience. But it's so hard to raise your GPA. Like in my personal experience, it was very difficult. I tried very hard with like an upward trend and taking extra classes, and it's just so difficult. So if you can really just do well in your classes and learn the material to help you on later on with the MCAT, that's a lot more, I think, worthy of your time. And you can always kind of do these outside experiences later on.
Okay, we ran out of questions again in the Q&A, but I do have like some other kind of like questions. I'm a third year first year transfer student currently at UCLA, and I was wondering, I'm planning to do or take some gap years, but I think like for me, um my parents are kind of like a little hesitant when I say gap years. And by gap years, I don't mean that I'm like kind of like relaxing and like having fun before med school. Like I'm trying to like work on my application. But do you have any advice on like if like your parents are kind of hesitant and you taking a gap year, like how did you kind of approach the conversation and um like explain to them that it's not like you're taking like a break from studying or like you're not motivated anymore?
Yes, I had to have this conversation with my parents too, and initially they were concerned that like this was just kind of a break and I wouldn't be able to get back into things. But I think once I explained to them that it was like very common for students to take gap years, it became more to them like they could kind of understand why people do it, and I was just honest with them and saying like, hey, I need this time to study for the MCAT. Here I am going to be taking this class from, October through January, and I'm going to take my MCAT in January. So I kind of like already had a plan. It was also during my 2 gap years, I also took physics. Like I took it over the summer after I graduated from Georgetown, at my local school, because the physics at my school was not very good. And so I figured why put myself through that? So I just ended up taking a full year of physics over a summer. And so I kind of had a plan in mind already. So I told them I was going to take physics and I was going to, take the MCAT. And then I applied to med school that year. So 2 gap years goes by really fast. One of the gap years is just applying. So I don't think they really realized like kind of timeline, but it was helpful for them to hear what my plan was so that they knew that I wasn't just kind of going into these gap years, just kind of dilly-dallying and not really know what I'm doing. But it is a hard conversation to have. But I think, if it's all about just, for my parents at least, kind of letting them know what I was doing, they became a lot more supportive of me taking the gap years. And ultimately, I think even if they weren't the most supportive, I knew that is what I needed to do. Like there was no other way around it. I couldn't apply to med school straight from college. So either way, I was going to have to do it. So it's unfortunate if like people in your family aren't understanding and supportive, but you kind of just know that that's what you got to do, and you make the most of it.
Thank you. That's helpful. I've been kind of like talking to my dad especially because he like has or he knows that like I'm interested in like going to med school, but he's also like he's had friends who have been more traditional like in the past that are more traditional as in like going straight in, but I I think now it's like a lot more common for people to take gap years to like kind of like strengthen their application before they kind of go in.
Yeah.
So thank you for that piece of advice.
Yeah, of course. Good luck with that conversation.
Did you also like did you continue doing like your sports like track and field and cross country like you mentioned earlier like they're undergrad do you have like do you find it as like a hobby like in med school, or is it kind of hard to find the time to do those kinds of hobbies?
Yeah, in college I ran just for fun. Obviously not as much as I did when I was like on the team in high school. But it's something that I've kind of done since then. I still run, to this day, and it's really just kind of a form of getting outside and relaxing. There are times in med school where there isn't as much time to run, and like do those kinds of things. But there are other rotations where are really flexible. And like your preclinical years are pretty flexible, at least at my school. We didn't have a lot of like required in-person things. I was one of those people who just watched recorded lectures at 2 times speed, and that was my vibe, my jam. But other people do go in person, so it's kind of up to you. But once you hit your rotation in clinical years, your schedule is not really your own anymore. Sadly, it's kind of like you're kind of up to the whatever rotation you're on, and so it's a little bit harder to kind of plan those things that you like to do. But definitely like something that is worth making time for. From what I learned and all the things that I experienced is taking an hour out of your day to exercise or do something you love or talk to a family member or your partner or somebody important to you is so helpful for your like mental health and physical health. That in the end it doesn't make a big deal. Like an hour in the grand scheme of things is not going to make a big difference in your grade or how you perform on a rotation. So it always seems like it does, but in the end it doesn't. So I definitely like recommend that you kind of stick with these hobbies and try to do them even when feels like it's super busy.
Did have another question pop through. Do you enjoy your career now? After working and studying for such a long journey to become a doctor, is medical school really worth it?
That is a great question. Yes, I think despite having like all these very difficult experiences as a pre-med student and in med school, it's not an easy journey. But for me, I feel like it has been worth it, and I'm glad I made the decision. Like I said, when I was a pre-med student and I took kind of that break from the pre-med track, I considered other careers. I thought, okay, maybe I'll be a lawyer, maybe I'll be a teacher. I also really enjoyed fashion, so like, okay, maybe I'll get a career in fashion. And I explored all of those, and I think ultimately, like none of them really fulfilled me as much as like being a physician. And I think I felt like a calling to be a physician and work with populations that I felt really passionate about. And I felt like that's where I wanted to make a difference in my life. So if you kind of like feel that calling and that connection, I think it's so worth it to get through these very difficult, this like very long journey, like you mentioned. And ultimately, like being a physician, yeah, it's a really rewarding experience. It's hard work, but it's there's like good job security if that's something that you're concerned about. And physicians ultimately, take out a lot of loans for school, but you get decently compensated for your work and you're able to pay those back. And, I think in general, physicians live good lives. And for me, like coming from a low income family and kind of living like that, even a resident salary to me is like more than my parents make. So I think that is like something, it's like perspective to have. And for me, it's really amazing to feel like next year I'll be making money, like real money. I've made money in the past with my little jobs, but like real money for the first time in my life after all these years of studying is really nice. But yeah, it's hard work and it's a long journey, but it's definitely worth it if you feel like it's something that you want to do.
Okay, we have another question. How do you balance your personal life as well as the life you live leading a busy medical student, like studying academic, kind of maybe like explain or like if you have um like a whole outline of like what you do in your day or anything like that.
Yeah. It's like sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder, depending on kind of what phase you're in med school. In your preclinical years, like I mentioned, it's a little bit easier to kind of have more control of your life, it feels like. So I was able to schedule things like I wanted. And basically every day of med school, almost every day without a fault of I would call my parents. Like that to me was like really important, and I made sure I made time for that, even if it was a quick 5 to 10 minute call. Other times it was longer depending what was going on. That is something that I did every day. And like things like that are really important to you, you can make the time for no matter how busy med school gets. And then other things that I try to do is just kind of have like simple goal of like, okay, I want to run at least 1-2 times a week. Like that was like kind of like my basic goal. And there were a lot of times where I didn't do that. But there were times where I had like the ability to do that. And I just kind of told myself that despite oftentimes, like before running, I would kind of say, oh, I don't have time. Oh, do I really feel like going for a run today? And not really. Like these feelings would come up, but like always after a run, I felt so much better and felt more energized in the end. So it was like so much more helpful for me to just spend those 30 minutes or whatever hour to get outside, instead of, feeling like, those 30 minutes would be more productive studying. So kind of making sure that you have a perspective of that doing things outside of school, they might not feel like they're productive in terms of like studying. It's taking away from your studying time, but it is productive in the sense that like you'll feel better after you do it, and think it will make your studying time even more productive because you're in a better headspace. And it's just, I think, overall good for your mental health and physical health. So it is hard to balance, but if there's like one or two or three things that are really important to you, you should make time for those things. And ultimately, by taking an hour or 2 hours out of your day to do these things, and like I said earlier, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't change much. Like I don't think it'll make that much of a difference in an exam score or like a clinical evaluation. It all, like, always ends up working out in the end.
All right, we got another one. My
Yeah, go ahead,
parents,
Mindy.
okay. My parents are first generation, but I am not. However, it doesn't make it any easier because medical school is hard for everyone. Any suggestions for students who are not first generation students?
Yeah, med school and being a pre-med student is not easy for anyone, I think. So definitely, like, just because you're like not a first gen student, or just because you don't identify as something that you feel like you need to identify with, or doesn't make your journey any easier or any or yeah, it's definitely a hard, long journey for most people who go through it. And I guess like tips and advice in general is kind of similar to what I would tell like any first gen student, is like, if you find yourself struggling, ask for help. Something that I learned the hard way. If you find good mentors, and everybody could use a good mentor on this journey. And make those connections with professors early on. Find that support system that you need, no matter who you are, what your identity is. Like all these things are very, like, I think, necessary when you're going through such a difficult time and long journey, that everybody could use these support systems and help. So no matter who you are, I think that's definitely something that I would recommend, is mentors and learning to ask for help, especially, and that's something I learned the hard way, like I said. So I don't know if there's like anything more specific that you were asking about, but I think in general, that's something that I would tell everybody who is going through the process.
And we have another one. Did working and simultaneously being a part of the pre-med track cause any like chronic sleep depression or deprivation? And if so, how did you cope with that and keep going?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I did not have the best sleep hygiene as a college student. In medical school, I was a lot better about it. I think I kind of realized that getting good sleep was way more important than staying up late and studying. But as a college student, I didn't know that or really feel that way. I guess I was again, like felt like I had to overcompensate and stay up late studying. And I like remember going to the library, and it was like 1 or 2 in the morning, going back to sleep. And it just like it's not good for you and your health and your ability to retain information you're learning. So working as a pre-med student, yeah, definitely took up some of my time, but it, and I didn't, like I said, didn't value like sleep hygiene as much. So it's definitely something that, like, if you're kind of going through that now, I would consider kind of changing up your sleep habits, because it is, I think, in the end, more helpful to get your sleep every night than to sleep deprive yourself of that. But it's something that in med school, despite being pretty like on tough rotations, like in surgery, my goal was to get at least like 6 hours of sleep every day, which for me it is enough. If I really need to, of course I'd love more sleep. Like who doesn't love sleep? But for me, like the minimum for me, I know was like 6 hours. So I tried to get that at least every day. And for the most part, I was able to do that, to get at least 6 to 8 hours every night during my clinical rotation years. So it's definitely possible. And I think I'm really happy that I prioritized that in the end. Like I said, things just work out, and I don't think it makes a big difference. That those extra hours of sleep that you're getting, because in the end, I think it helps you with like your mental health and just feeling like you're okay during the day, retain information. You're able to stay awake and not, in college, I think I was always tired. I think I even like went to see the doctor because of this. I like got a sleep study done. Like these are things that I think if I just would have had better sleep hygiene, I would have been like more alert and awake. But it was something that I definitely struggled with, was feeling like this chronic fatigue. And like there really wasn't anything wrong with me in the end, but it was just, I think, just very poor sleep habits. So don't recommend. Please get your sleep.
That was something actually that I had trouble with, I think, my first quarter when I was transferring here, or because I was like under the impression that everything was going to be so much harder, because I came from community college, and then when I transferred to university, I was like, oh my gosh, like this is the real deal. And it was a lot more difficult. I think these couple quarters have been pretty difficult for me in general. But I think like I only realized that poor sleep was affecting, I think, my overall health as well, because like I got cold so often, and
Yes.
I just felt like terrible, like going into class and just like kind of like sleeping in through lectures. And then after that realization, I was like, okay, I really need to focus on like prioritizing my health and making sure I feel good. So
Yeah. Yeah. I'm
yeah.
glad that, yeah, you're able to kind of get to that point eventually. It took me a while, but I'm glad you're kind of already there.
We had one more question. Any research you did at Georgetown that helps for your medical school application?
Yeah, research was never my thing, but as a pre-med student, I think like we feel the pressure to do it, and to say that we have research experience. As a psychology major, I found a lab from a psychology professor who was doing some work in like early childhood development, which I thought was interesting. So I gave it a shot, and I worked in her lab for like 6 months, or like a little bit over one semester. But I didn't have any publications. I didn't do any poster presentations. I was merely just like an assistant, and I was watching videos of incarcerated young parents interacting with their children through this program, and kind of seeing if the program was helping them better interact with them. And I was just kind of coding these videos, and it was really just kind of just like tedious work that I was doing to help the lab. But I did include it on my application. It was not something that I was ever really asked about on my interviews, because it wasn't really a big part of like some people write a lot about like their research interest in their personal statement or other parts of their application. But for me, that was not something I focused on. So it's up to you if you feel like you want to try research. I'd say give it a shot, but it's not something that you need to absolutely do to get into medical school. Now, of course, like if you want to go to like a top research institution, like I don't know, like UCSF or like Johns Hopkins or like one of those med schools, I think they do value people who do research more than other schools. But thankfully, like USC was my dream school, and it's a very clinical focused school. It is like a research and like I would say a good research institution, but ultimately, I don't think they like cared as much as some other schools about research experience. So you don't need to have publications or poster presentations to get into medical school.
All right, I think that pretty much wraps up all the questions in the Q&A. Thank you so much. Oh, there's okay, so there's like one really short one. I'm not, we can like have this as the ending. Is there any suggestions for tools to select medical schools? Like how did you compile your medical school list?
Yeah. I was like, I kind of mentioned earlier, I was not very smart in my making a list. I did use the medical, what's it called? The MSAR, medical school admissions, something I think is what it's called. I don't know, but the AMC has this great database that you can look at for allopathic medical schools. And I think there's also one for osteopathic medical schools. And they have a database of all the schools that you can kind of look through their general stats and things that they look for. You can look at like percent of out-of-state students. When you're applying to out-of-state schools that are public universities, consider how many out-of-state people they take, because oftentimes they'll have to have, because they get public funding, they'll have to have a certain amount of in-state students. So something to consider. I made the mistake of applying to like the University of like Arkansas and like places like that don't take a lot of out-of-state students. So I had like no chance, right? So think about that. When you're looking at the MSAR and other similar databases, something that I thought was a great tip was there's a way of looking at averages for applicants to the program versus averages for matriculants to the program. And oftentimes the matriculant average is lower than the applicant average, because applicants of like really high MCAT and GPAs will apply to a lot of schools that, you know, everybody else is applying to, and they'll bring up the averages for these programs. But in the end, oftentimes people who actually end up going to these schools will have a lower GPA or a lower MCAT. So it kind of helped give me a better gauge of like how much of a chance I had at a school like that. But don't limit yourself based on just purely MCAT or GPA averages, because if anything, like I had a super low GPA that was like way below average for most medical schools. And I think having a strong MCAT and a strong personal story and a good personal statement really goes a long way. So when making your list, don't limit yourself. Definitely have like a few reach schools, a few, you know, like target schools and some safety schools. That's kind of the advice that I was given. In my head, basically every school was a reach when I was applying. And so I cast a wide net, and I really was like willing to go anywhere that would take me. But I think you do have some say. And so definitely med school applications are expensive. And so, you know, use these great tools that you can find online to help guide it and navigate the process.
All right, I think we can finally like wrap it up, and then I'll hand it off to Jubin.
No, I don't have anything else. If there's no more questions, thank you again for coming today, Melissa, and good luck on your how many more? It's like 10 more, one more month from now, you'll find out where you end up. So good
I
luck
know,
with
thank you
that.
so much.
A
Yeah.
month, and what is it? Is it the 21st or the 20th?
March 15th. So a little bit less than a month, I'll figure out.
Ooh,
Going.
gosh.
So fingers crossed.
Fingers and toes crossed. All right. Well, good
Thanks.
luck. I'm sure you'll do fine. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming, and have a great long weekend.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Melissa.